You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
C.J. Box.
Thank you to our sponsors who make the show possible, Patricia Gilliam and Richard Fox, specifically for this episode. I really appreciate their support. They are amazing authors, and they put their money where their mouth is when they support the writer community. Thank you for supporting this episode. Also to Dabble. Writing novels is hard. Dabble makes it easier. Dabble replaces your word processor doing what it can't. Dabble organizes your manuscript, story notes, and plot. It simplifies story, leaving more room in your brain to create. And after all, that's what being a writer is all about. Dabble was built from the ground up specifically for writing novels. It takes minutes to learn, and it makes writing a joy. See how Dabble will revolutionize the way you write with a free trial at www.dabblewriter.com. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have C.J. Box back on the show with us. He was here last year when his latest book came out in the Joe Pickett series. He's got a brand new one out now. I've had the book for a couple of weeks now, and it is fantastic. C.J. Box mystery thriller. Welcome back to the show, C.J.
Thank you, and I'm glad you like the book so much.
It's amazing. When you were on last year, your newest book, The Disappeared, had just come out, and that book debuted at number one on the New York Times and stayed for about 5 weeks, I think. Is that right?
That's right, exactly. Yeah.
Man, what is that feeling like when you put in so much into a series and into each individual book, and then to when you sit back and you're no longer in control, up until that point, there's editing, there's the writing, there's all the stuff, and there comes a point where you just have to step back and say, the book's going to do what it's going to do, and it's no longer in my hands.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and then I've got a cold this morning. So
me too, so we'll give each other a little grace.
Okay. Yeah, it is kind of fascinating, and my life before the books came out was in tourism marketing and marketing kind of things, where you plan, you try to set the stage, and then you just see what happens. And it's not unlike that in a lot of ways, but over the years, it's been just kind of fascinating for me to experience finally getting on the New York Times list, and then seeing it climb, and then finally hitting, I think it was 3 books ago, first time it hit number one. And now it's not just if it's number one, but how many weeks is it on the list. So you're never really satisfied or think I've arrived and that's it, because it could all, everything could get jerked out under, or a book could be, I guess, wildly unpopular and take you right off the rails. But all I can do is just write the next book and let the chips fall in a way. And this particular one, Wolfpack, I really honestly had a really good feeling about from the very beginning, because some books fall together really well. Other ones are more of a struggle and more work. This one, from the first idea and the first inception and page one, just fell together really quickly and well, I thought. So I have a good feeling about it, and we'll see.
Well, speaking of, several books ago, you hit the New York Times, and then the expectation goes higher. Well, now how long is it going to stay, and that sort of thing. And with each book, it seems like that the audience grows and becomes more invested in the character and in these stories. I know that you've written several Joe Pickett novels. You'll have to correct me on how many exactly, but you've also written some standalones, and some people write standalones and they're breakout hits. other readers like to get invested in the character and kind of feel like the story grows with them. Do you feel like writing a character like Joe and having people become invested in him and his life, do you think that helps to bring new readers along and to kind of build your author brand, if you will? I kind of hate that term, but you know what I mean.
I do, yeah. This is the 19th Joe Pickett.
I knew it was a lot.
Time.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, yes. I don't think maybe as strategically as I should sometimes when it comes to the character and the growth of the series. I just write it book by book and never really look ahead. And I don't think so much about the brand as just to keep the characters consistent, because all the books are told in real time. You know, Joe Pickett has gotten older. His family has grown up. His daughters are all moving out and going to college. And in this particular book, Joe and his wife Mary Beth are facing an empty nest for the first time. So things change enough that to me it's always pretty fresh. So I don't think too much about what's going on or what's going to happen next. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it does amaze me when I travel around how invested readers get into the characters. And sometimes I almost feel like some readers know the characters better than I do. And that's always kind of a weird feeling.
Oh yeah, I've had my friend Craig Johnson on the show several times, and we always laugh about that he'll go into a place and have an Absaroka County Sheriff's hat on, and someone will tell him, you're not allowed to wear that. That's Walt Longmire's, and he's like, well, I'm Walt's dad, and then like people get so invested in characters. It's so funny.
But it's also great.
Oh, exactly.
Because, they care about him. One thing in this book in particular, when I started it, I thought it's time to kind of shake things up a little bit and remind readers that, anything can happen to anybody, and that it's not just going to complacently go along. So, as you know, having read it, there's a reckoning going on in this book where there's a lot of very familiar characters have been in the books for years that don't make it out. And I think that's important to do, even though sometimes it'll upset some people, but I think it's important to do to keep the series fresh, and also to remind them that, anything can happen to anybody, no matter how much you might like them or not.
Well, to borrow from maybe a pop culture reference that a lot of people will get, when we're dealing with, say the Marvel movies right now, which are kind of uber hot, and we've got this movie coming up in a month or two where some people are really wondering, which characters are going to live or die, and then other people are maybe jaded from there being 80 years worth of comic books and say, well, no one ever really dies. So there's no tension there, because we all know everybody's going to be back the next time, and maybe they develop a story that works around it, but they're not really going to be gone. When you're writing a series, 19 books, like you have, the longer you write, I would think that your tools for tension probably get fewer and fewer, up to the point where you're going to have to kill somebody, but to prove to people that anything can still happen. Like you said, how do you start making those decisions? And when when you've written 19 books, do you start looking at, these are characters that I can count on, these are characters that I see a future for? Does it have to be a surprise for you as well to really make it a surprise for the reader, I guess is what I'm asking?
I think that's right to some degree, but also it reflects the real-time nature of the books. For example, a very important character in the Joe Pickett books over the years has been the governor of Wyoming, who Joe has kind of a strange and odd relationship with, but they also tend to, eventually come to have some mutual respect. Well, the governor cannot be the governor forever. He can only do an 8-year term. So once I do the timeline on that and figure the governor has to retire this year, then that means there's going to be a new governor. And so I can add that and go from there. Same with the office holders, other terms of other office holders, and I think just the element of surprise, which sometimes surprises me, and sometimes I go back and decide I'm going to let somebody make it instead of kill them, and or the other way around. But I don't look ahead saying, what's going to come next with this character. I just try to do it for that book.
Right. How do you keep a character like Joe Pickett growing? And the books are very real time, and I know that he's, you can't do like some authors and give a year or two between stories because, Joe would be 80, by now. How do you keep a character like that growing, and learning new things and experiencing new things, after 19 books?
Well, actually, it occurred to me a couple of years ago that I wasn't sure how old Joe Pickett was. So I went back to the very first book where he is 34 and did a timeline for each book subsequent, because some happen a year after the last one, some are 6 months, some are 4 months, some are right back to back. So I did the timeline to figure out exactly how old he was, and he's now 50. So because they're real time, but they're not always a year apart, he's got a lot of years ahead to go. And but I just, I'm older than Joe Pickett, and I can remember, what it's like when your knees start to hurt and you don't really want to get in a fight, or you want to do things in a different way. Plus the fact that he's been through so many things, so many adventures, so many really kind of bitter situations that he's gotten a little harder bark now than he did when the series first started, and I just think that's natural. He can't always be naive and totally well-meaning in every situation because he's been betrayed so much. So just try to kind of keep it real in a way.
Right. And let's recap for people that may not have listened to the first episode that we did. And I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes so people can go back and listen to that first one. But Joe Pickett is not your typical protagonist in a mystery thriller. Who is Joe, and how did he come to you?
Well, Joe is a Wyoming game warden, meaning he works for the state. In real life, Wyoming game wardens, there's only 50 of them, and they have districts that they call them up to as big as 5,000 square miles that they're in charge of enforcing the game and fish regulations in. And game wardens in real life are very much alone when they're out in the field. They can't call backup because they're too isolated. They deal with things in their own way, and rarely kind of get involved with other law enforcement unless they're forced to or need to. And that kind of goes to his character too. He's very much kind of a lone guy with a mission. And he's happily married to his wife, Mary Beth, and he's got 3 daughters, and is very devoted to them. He's not a private eye with a lot of baggage or, an alcoholic who's raging around. He's very much a normal guy, and he screws up sometimes too, often actually. And I think because he's a human character, that a lot of readers can kind of empathize with him. And I think it kind of creates more tension in a lot of instances because he's not a Superman, and anything can happen, and he can make the wrong turn, or he can be bested easily. He's not going to beat up every guy or hang out with every girl. He's just trying to do his job.
Well, and he also doesn't have every tool at his disposal. He doesn't have a crime lab on speed dial. He doesn't, he can't get, overnight DNA results and all of this kind of stuff that are real crutches for a lot of mystery writers. And he really harkens back to Sherlock Holmes style stories where it's really about his intellect and his, how he interacts with the places around him and the people around him, and to really, unravel these things, which I think all of us can relate to, and a lot easier.
Also, there's a lot of times you can't even get a cell signal where he's at, which is very much real life out here in Wyoming, where you can go hours sometimes without getting one. So you've got it does make things more difficult. Sometimes it makes things a little easier as a writer, because you can't count on all that instant technology. But it's true to life in the circumstances that I write about.
Wyoming very much becomes a character in the book. As much as we depend on CJ showing up and kind of counting on his character, we can count on Wyoming throwing the worst at us in terms of weather and the vastness of it. There's you're a Wyoming native, right?
Correct. Yes.
Have you ever thought of writing somewhere else, or is Wyoming just kind of the perfect canvas for your stories?
Well, it's the perfect canvas for Joe Pickett, since he is, a state employee and he works in Wyoming. But I've written 6 standalones, and then the standalones are all set somewhere else. They're all in the West, because that's what I'm most familiar with. Colorado, Montana, Idaho, South Dakota, North Dakota. So I like to use areas that I know, but I'm not as intimate with as Wyoming. But Joe Pickett will always be in Wyoming. It doesn't make any sense to have him anywhere else. But I enjoy traveling too, and I like going to locations outside of the state where I'm going to set a book. I've got a new one coming out this August called The Bitterroots, that's going to be set in western Montana by the Bitterroot Mountains. And so I spent time up there last summer, just poking around, interviewing people, getting the feel of it, so I could write the book, and I do enjoy that.
Each book you bring in some new elements and get to tackle something that's on maybe our collective minds, or maybe something that's kind of hot, a topic to talk about, and bring those into the books. Tell me about drones, and how did you get interested in this, and how does it find its way to Joe?
Well, it kind of came out on my radar screen when there were some problems in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming a couple of years ago, where the Park Service asked visitors to stop using drones to go look at wildlife. And then I was interested in that, and delved a little deeper and found out that there have been some real serious issues with drones being used to spot or target wildlife for hunters, or locate herds. All those things are illegal to do. There's laws against them in every state, but there's always a small number of trophy hunters that are miscreants and want to get the biggest possible animal. And one way to do that is to figure out where they are in advance. And drone technology has been used for that. And I thought, the juxtaposition of a very expensive and sophisticated commercial drone in the hands of a civilian using it for those kind of purposes would be a very interesting way to open the book.
Well, yeah, I'm very much an outdoorsman, and very much support hunters' rights and things like that. But this is just not hunting. This is that's kind of a horrible thing people are doing, and I love that you tackled that.
It's the difference between hunting and targeting.
Yes.
So it's a big difference.
Yeah. At the end of the last book, you left us with Joe had a bad turn. Tell us about that, and then how you bring him into the story. What's going on with Joe at the beginning of this book?
Yeah, at the end of the last book that disappeared, Joe is actually in the backseat of a state trooper's car, being transported to Cheyenne, where the governor is going to personally fire him, because Joe has done some things that the governor didn't like. This book starts out, Joe Pickett's got a nice new home, a new pickup. Everything is looking up. He's been restored to his old position, got his old badge number back. And, anybody who's read the series know that now, with everything going along so swimmingly, it's going to take a bad turn real soon. But then the explanation is what has transpired between the last book and this one. And the governor's, new governor's own kind of prestige has taken a turn as well. So yeah, Joe's back, got a job, and now the drones.
Well, anytime that everything is going great for Joe, you know that this is like the perfect setup for a country and western song. You know, everything
right.
can go wrong from here. Oh man. What about, how has your writing process changed over the course of these 19 Joe Pickett books and the 6 or 7 other standalones that you have? How has the way you approach the storytelling changed?
Well, you know, I don't think it's changed so much as I've just been able to refine it. Because the methodology I kind of used for the very first book, which was to start with the issues and the controversies and the plot points and research the heck out of them, and then start to build the plot, outline it till the end, is still the same thing I do now. With every book, I sit down and there will be several things I kind of want to cover. For the Wolf Pack, it's drone technology. It's also the opioid epidemic in the U.S., where it comes from, the Sinaloa cartel. And I wanted to have a female game warden as part of the story. And so starting with those 3 things. Oh, and one other aspect is, you know, kind of federal overreach when it comes to federal agency law enforcement personnel being sent out into the West. So those 4 things I kind of started out with and started finding links between them, and then the book came from there.
Well, federal overreach is a great topic that has been at the center of a lot of great stories through the years, true and fiction. When you're dealing with that, and you see how technology has really enhanced a lot of that, do you start factoring in kind of the way society's changing, the tools that are not only available to law enforcement and to government, but also the tools we walk around with smartphones and things like that? Do you start making connections between those things, and do those crop up in the story?
Yes, they do, absolutely. And the other big aspect to it of the things I write about is Wyoming is 50% owned by the federal government. Just like most western states, the percentages vary all the way, I think, to 70% of Nevada. So that brings in a whole other aspect. That means that there are, you know, federal employees and law enforcement within the state that have their own jurisdiction, and it creates more tensions, not only among the federal agencies, but also with the state and county and local agencies. So, you know, I think Michael Connolly, when he was talking about writing, it's important to have tension on every page. And that's pretty easy to do when you have that many law enforcement agencies in a rural place, all kind of stumbling all over each other, which is something that happens in real life in the West. Yeah.
And makes for crazy great story fodder. You write the Joe Pickett books in third person with a kind of a limited perspective. Have you ever thought about writing from Joe's perspective?
I've thought about it, but I don't think I would do it. I did write a standalone once called 3 Weeks to Say Goodbye. That was done in the first person. That was it's a very dark kind of story. I found it too limiting in a way. You know, sometimes I like reading first person, but I also have a fundamental problem with a lot of it in that, and I know this sounds ridiculous, but sometimes I think, if this guy is such a good writer, why is he a detective? Or, you know, why is he a busted-up old cop when he's this good of a writer and can observe these things? So it takes me out of the book sometimes, and I don't want to do that.
Oh, that's such a great point. I don't know that I've ever really thought about that. But yeah, if your narrator can be so observant to tell you this compelling story, then they should have figured this out already. That's great. I love that. How much, you're putting out like a book a year, in this series, meaning, you don't have a whole lot of time to waste on maybe stories that just don't develop and don't go anywhere. How much planning goes into one of your books before the actual writing gets underway?
really quite a bit, and it's a part of the whole process I really enjoy. Once I come up with those 3 or 4 plot points, like I mentioned earlier, then I do the research, and I like to do it myself. I don't want to rely on other researchers, and that means going to the places where I need to go, doing the things that Joe Pickett or other people are doing in the books, and getting that first-hand knowledge. And then once I feel pretty comfortable with all that subject matter, then I start with an outline. And the outlines can vary from just a few pages of bullet points from the beginning to the end to real extensive outlines, sometimes that have gone on 40 pages. And then I start writing the book. So I plot it out in advance. It doesn't mean things don't change. They always do. Sometimes the ending changes that I've been aiming towards the whole time. But I do have everything in mind when I start writing the book, because I just can't afford enough, days where I just stare at the screen or go off odd directions and then have to go back and take it all out. Really try to plan it out as best I can, and that works best for me.
I think some writers would say that they don't like outlining and especially don't like going that in depth, because if they knew where the story was going, they would just write the book. Are there any tools that you use that then when you start thinking through the story and start conceptualizing who's going to be in it, where you're going, that just keep the ideas that become those bullet points flowing?
Well, what I always find in every book is that there are certain storylines and bullet points that I have planned that either get changed or get eliminated, and new ones crop up. So no matter how tightly I think I plotted something, it's going to go directions that I never anticipated. And that's exciting to me sometimes, to be going along a direction and suddenly say, oh, whoa, what if this happened? And that surprises me, too, and I think it does the reader, because there's no way to foreshadow something that if you don't know what's coming. And it just happens. It's hard to explain.
When how long do you spend in that outlining process? Is it a couple of days? Is it a couple of weeks? How long does it take for the story to gel?
Often a couple of months, really. For example, I'm working on a new Joe Pickett book now for next year, and I spent about a month and a half gathering the research and getting all the kind of foundation in place by doing some traveling. I'm very interested. One of the big aspects of hunting these days in this part of the world is long range shooting, because the technology and the ballistics have come to the point where anybody can go buy a gun and a scope that they can hit something with at 1,000 yards, which was unbelievable a few years ago, except for military snipers. That sort of changed hunting, and I had to do some research on that and go to a couple of the gun manufacturers and talk to them about how does this all work. And it took a while to do that before I was comfortable with being able to write it.
Wow. I would think that if you have an extensive outline like that, especially if you go as deep as like the 40-page outline like you talked about, I would think the writing becomes very easy after that, because you've got this fully formed skeleton and you're just putting flesh and bones on it.
Well, I wouldn't say easy, but I would say it doesn't become aimless. At least, and there are certain days where, I just don't feel like writing, but I know where the story's going, so I can at least get it, I can advance it. Then go back later and backfill it a little bit. But I'm not just sitting there going, I wonder what's going to happen today. I certainly have read books where I feel like the writer kind of goes that direction. Often it works. Other times I think, I wish you would have fixed that or thought about it a little more.
Oh, there's nothing worse than getting to like 90% of a book and you realize this author has no idea how to land this thing, and then it just ends. Something magical comes out, and you're like, really? I wish you'd have spent some more time on that. But
I think so. Yeah, I think that's a cheat for the reader. And although some of the best authors, some of my favorites tend to work that way. like Larry McMurtry, for example. You know, he nails it with so many books like Lonesome Dove and other ones. And he'll even admit he didn't know what was going to happen, and he didn't know how to end it. And that, I don't think that's fair.
I agree. CJ, you know, when you become a writer that's on a schedule like you are, and you know, the books become super important and deadlines become important, it's easy to get sequestered in writer world, and you know, I think we all deal with this at some point, and you find yourself relying on past experiences to maybe get back in touch with setting and you know, remembering conversations and things like that. How, as a writer that's as busy as you are, how do you stay in touch with your surroundings, with you know, just connecting with people and making sure that you're not you know, just the lonesome writer who spends all day in his fictional world? Are there things that you do to keep connected?
Yeah, you know, that's a really good question, and rarely asked. But what I try, and I think about that a lot, exactly. And that part of it is, you know, I mean, I don't live in New York. I don't live in L.A. I live in a very rural part of Wyoming on a little ranch, and I go to town every day to the post office and interact with people all day locally. And they know I'm a writer, but they don't act like it's any big deal. It's just another job. And I think that helps keep me really grounded. But also the research part of it with each book is a new direction. So that means I have to leave my little nest and go somewhere and talk to people and drive around and experience new things, so that I'm not always drawing from something in the past, but it's all new to me. And I think that keeps the books fresh, and it keeps me interested.
Yeah, I think it's super important. It's so easy to just get caught up that you forget to raise your head and look around and remember we're writing stories about people and not just, you know, get caught up in the. I've met a lot of people that get so caught up that you know, it's 5 years and they have no idea what's going on in the world.
Right. I think that reflects in the books too.
Yeah, I think so too. You know, that people say that the most important writing advice is to read a lot and write a lot, but I think you need to get out and observe people, and I think human interaction is a huge part of it, especially if you want to write realistic dialogue and you know, interactions. I think you've got to have that. You got to keep filling the well back up.
I couldn't agree more, and that's one of my biggest complaints. Sometimes with you know, so-called literary authors that live in their own head for so long that what they're writing bears no resemblance to reality. And even though sometimes people sometimes like to read that and prefer that, I don't. I always tend to gravitate toward writers who are more reality based and do their research and are teaching you things or exposing things as opposed to just writing beautifully about them.
Yeah, a little navel gazing goes a long way.
Yeah, you can do that on your own time, I think.
That's right. A few years ago, you released a short story collection, Shots Fired, stories from Joe Pickett country. Do you are there occasions where a short story comes to you? Do you use those to maybe fill in gaps? Is there just a little situation you think, you know, this would be a perfect little self-contained idea to write a story about? What do you think about short stories?
I personally love short stories. I love to read them. I think they're harder to write than a novel, because everything has to be there in just a few pages and a few words. You don't have the luxury of drawing a story out. And I wish people like short stories more than they do, but they don't. Very few magazines anymore will publish short stories. So it almost has to be an anthology or a collection like the one I did. But yes, exactly. There's certain ideas that just won't work in a Joe Pickett book or in a standalone that are just small and intimate and self-contained, and I'll write a short story about it, and there probably will be another short story collection at some point down the road, but it takes a while to gather them all and write them all, and I tend not to do them just on spec.
Yeah.
It's usually if there's a request, somebody's writing an anthology about something, or something like that, then that'll give me the impetus to do it.
Yeah. I think it's a great tool for writers that gets overlooked a lot. You know, like you said, it's sometimes easier to write a novel. It's very easy to write yourself into a corner with a short story because you don't have the length to wiggle, you know, your character out of it. I think it's a good exercise to stay sharp on how each chapter, each, you know, scene, everything needs to do something. And sometimes as novelists, you know, you can kind of wander and meander, knowing that you'll have time to get out of it.
I agree. The book the short story collection Shots Fired that you mentioned, my favorite short story I have ever written is in that book, and it's called The Blood Knot. And it was commissioned by a newspaper in England where they asked writers to write a short story no more than 1,000 words. And that was quite a challenge, and because every word had to count. And now, after all these years, I realize that's probably one of my favorites because everything had to be just there and precise. And, you know, you don't have to worry about that with a novel.
Right. The new book, Wolfpack, is out everywhere now when you're hearing this, hardcover Kindle edition audiobook. CJ, I think this is one of your best yet. The title, Wolfpack, what does that allude to?
Well, two things, actually. One is that Joe Pickett, early on in the book, gets a call from a local rancher that says that there's a pack of wolves on his ranch, even though there's not supposed to be wolves there. And Joe Pickett investigates. He sees a wolf that he's seen several times throughout the series, and realizes that wolf is running with some others. But at the same time, there's 4 assassins associated to the Sinaloan cartel in Mexico that are working their way north after a mystery man target. And they are known as the Wolf Pack because they're so effective. So it's got the two things going on at once, the real wolves and the two-legged wolves.
I love the illusion that you draw there. Also, there's some great dynamics in this book. You mentioned earlier you wanted to bring in a female game warden, and I love her character. I hope she is in more books. But you also have this other storyline with Joe's daughter, Lucy. How were you thinking about these things and how these different interactions? You've got Joe and his daughter. You've got Joe and this new game warden he's teaming up with. Wolves could factor into a lot of areas in this book.
Yeah, yes, and they do.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Yes, they do. Joe's daughter is the youngest daughter, is the last one at home. And when she leaves, they're going to have an empty nest. And a lot of the books she's been in, but this is the first one where she's sort of been brought up front and center. So that was fun to write about. And the fact that her boyfriend is associated with this mystery man that Joe is investigating just adds another level of intrigue and tension to the whole thing. Because Joe doesn't want to mess up this thing for his daughter, but he has to do his job as well. And so that all comes into play. And I like to have Joe interacting with lots of females throughout the book because I think that makes it interesting and not, a super thriller. And in this case, he just kind of works hand in glove with the female game warden until things go pear-shaped.
Yeah. And we'll leave it at that. Wolfpack, the new book, CJ box, out everywhere now. We're going to send everybody to pick up their copy. There's links to it in the show notes. CJ, what's coming up next for you? Are you any events or anything that people could look forward to?
Well, starting March 12th, I'll be on a book tour for Wolfpack. I'll be all around the country, so people can find the schedule on my website, which is cjbox.net. And then when that is all over, I'll resume working on the next Joe Pickett novel until the book standalone called Bitterroots comes out in August. And then there'll be a new Joe Pickett book next March.
Excellent. That'll be number 20.
That's right.
That's right. Well,
and I hope in between.
Absolutely. Well, come back and celebrate with us for the 20th book, and wish you much success on the standalone this summer as well.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I was walking through the woods between Wolfert's Roost and the future site of my father's Stone Manor house. The house would eventually stand on what had been old Baltus's pumpkin field, the land where I had found my grandfather's head. Father had chosen the spot for its view of the Hudson River. Knoll was to be a grand mansion in the Gothic Revival style, but at the time the mansion was but a few foundations of Van Brunt stone. I had become fond of the place already, the idea of it, and I spent many a night alone in a shack on the property. My mother disapproved. She would have me sleep in the room across from hers in our townhouse. But I was 15 and did not answer to her. I kept a bottle of spirits hidden in the crook of 2 walnut trees near old Baltus's grave. I thought he would approve of the gesture. I had stopped along my way to fetch it out. At the moment the first pull of liquor touched my throat, I heard a ghastly, inhuman laugh. I was not alone in the woods. Had God sent the horseman after me? Had I sinned that terribly? I ran through the wood and found the field where Knoll was to be built. The outline of the foundations was barely discernible beneath the snow. An apparition stood there. Though I have seen him many times since, I shall never forget my first glimpse. Gaunt in moonlight, headless, exuding power and malice. A magic thing in the land of the ordinary. The headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. What chills those words evoke. It charged at me, hatchet raised. I stood transfixed, unable to move, unable to even imagine escape. This was the servant of God, after all, sent to strike down sinners. I hurled the bottle from my hand, ashamed that I had become a drunkard as Baltus had been. It shattered against the foundations of Knoll. I stretched out my arms and awaited judgment. A piercing white light broke the darkness. The horse reared. "Not my Dillon!" cried Agatha, appearing from the wood. She held a skull in her hand. It shone brightly as a diamond. And in that moment I understood. The horseman did not serve God. He served my grandmother. Perhaps in that moment I came to see Agatha and God as one and the same. The unholy spirit fought her command. A foreleg of the demon horse struck my head with such power that I fell backwards with a cry and knew no more. I carry the scar to this day. A slight indentation in my temple, barely noticeable. In my days of courting I was told that when I am angry the patch of insulted skull bone will stand out in a disturbing manner. I have never had occasion to see this phenomenon, however, as I am generally well pleased whenever I pass a mirror.
Flesh, Blood, Steel, the new book from David Allen Jones. 16-year-old Jake Harris wakes up after a horrific car accident to find 13 years have come and gone. He is 29 years old, a cyborg, and one of the world's most feared assassins. Horrified by the things he's done, things he can't remember, Jake vows never to kill again. Unfortunately, the company that owns Jake has other plans. They're not about to lose their top hitman to the errant memories of his teenage self. When Jake manages to escape them, they launch a worldwide manhunt that ranges from a near-future New York City to Paris. Desperate to remain himself, Jake joins a rebel faction dedicated to wresting control of the world's governments from the hands of militarized corporations. Using his enhanced body and perceptions, he is able to aid them in their fight. But Jake doesn't realize the rebels have their own plans for him, ones that involve unleashing his unique talents on their enemies. Faced with a dark past he can't recall and uncertain whom he should trust, Jake must come to terms with the sinister choices that molded him into the man he became. The question is, can he avoid doing it all again? Assassins aren't born, they're programmed. Flesh, Blood, Steel by David Allen Jones.